Eugenics and social Darwinism have a very complex relationship. This is not a simple issue of eugenics is just the political wing of Darwinism. And as we'll see, when the genetic model emerges in the late 19th, early 20th century, that has a huge impact upon eugenics. And the one thing we can say about the genetic model at that time was it definitely was not Darwin. Defining eugenics, well, we can break it down into its Greek components. It's eu, which as prefix means good or well, and the suffix genes, eugenics, therefore well-born. Or as Francis Galton put it, the study of all agencies under human control which can improve or impair the racial quality of future generations. He's a great believer in race. For him, race can be reduced to things like Anglo-Saxon, German, French, on top of categories like African as well. It's a very plastic view of the notion of race. We're going to explore the major developments in the 19th, 20th century, look at some of the pioneering figures, ask what connections exist between Darwin, social Darwinism and eugenics, delineate the connection between eugenics and politics, and investigate the impact of eugenic ideas upon society. Now here's the thing, there is no doubt we can establish a genealogy between Darwin's biological theories, Darwin's social views, and the social Darwinian program. We can examine and identify links between the emergence of eugenics and those other aspects of Darwinism. This is categorically so. Darwin and Darwinism and social Darwinism are all connected. This is not to blame Darwin. Darwin came up with the ideas, man of his time. You think about this. We're not talking about something airy-fairy here. We're not talking about an idea about biology that kind of lets us know about the way that we have developed. We're talking about something far more powerful. Now, this is how ideas become action. Now, often people don't like to connect ideas with action. But you have an idea, you put it out there in the world, it does stuff. You're not necessarily going to be in control of the stuff that it does. I'm certain that as Victorian as Darwin was, he would not have been particularly keen on the measures that are going to be described. But if you put an idea out there and that idea is acted upon, idea becomes action. So that's really what's at stake here. But let's not talk any more about Darwin at this time. Let's talk about Francis Galton, the man that came up with the term eugenics, the man that started promoting the idea that there should be some consideration taken to human reproduction and human breeding. Francis Galton can be regarded as the founding father of eugenics. And as we'll see, of course, he's a cousin of Darwin. Extraordinary man, extraordinary life. It's a real boy's own adventure. His grandparents were Quakers, so from that quiescent dissenting sect. Quaker gunmakers. Quaker gunmakers. Have a think about it. Why is that weird? He was a child prodigy. He goes to do maths at Cambridge and he has a nervous breakdown which may or may not be connected with his sexuality. He attempts to do medicine like Darwin. He fails at it. After university, he becomes a traveller and explorer. He goes to Sudan, the Middle East. He may have picked up gonorrhea that could have led to him becoming infertile the rest of his life. Whatever went on, he seems to have been disturbed by what occurred to him, particularly in the Middle East. In Southwest Africa, he conducts one of his early bizarre experiments, trying to use surveying methods to measure the buttocks of the wives of a chieftain that he's hanging out with. He's not an ordinary person by any stretch of the imagination. When he comes back, he marries Louisa Jane Butler. The marriage was childless and possibly loveless. For whatever reason, he can't have children. And all the time, he's thinking about inheritance, stock. And he did believe that he was from extremely good stock. Now he's thinking of his family like a bunch of thoroughbred racehorses. And if we have a look at Galton's family tree, we can see the full extent of the genius. So Galton is part of a family that includes the Wedgwoods, that includes the Darwins, and seems to exude the inheritance of genius. He was an incredibly eccentric inventor and scientist. Here is the Galton whistle, designed by him to emit measured high-frequency sounds for determining the upper limit of hearing. used for tests of human high frequency, blah-de-blah, and dogs. And very early on, he's starting to try and construct experiments to demonstrate a rational but also a Darwinian world. I should say, in 1871, he does a study of the gregariousness in cattle and in men. In 1872, my favourite one, the efficacy of prayer. He wanted to demonstrate that prayer wasn't efficacious. What he did was he made this hypothesis that if prayer worked, then people that were prayed for would live longer and suffer less disease. And he thought, well, you know, you go to a Church of England ceremony, who are people prayed for in the ceremony? It's the Queen and the royal family and the government and the ministers, the Archbishop and the bishops. You know, they all get name-checked fairly early on in the whole process. And he thought, well, you know, if I look at their life expectancy compared to other people's life expectancy and see if they live longer, then we can say that prayer was probably efficacious. And what he was able to demonstrate was that it wasn't. No, these people lived no longer than the people that weren't being prayed. Ostrich farming in the Cape Colony, conventional representation of the horse in motion, head growth in students at the University of Cambridge, just to make sure that they're all bloody clever. And then the one that is contested, but aside from eugenics, is something that he's going to become most famous for, fingerprints. Working out how to index fingerprints so you can use them to detect criminals. Sun signals to Mars, what was that all about? And rather bizarrely, in 1899, the strawberry cure for gout. Galton is deeply influenced by Origin and deeply respectful of his cousin. From his own family tree, his own experience, he has developed a strong belief that mental characteristics were as heritable as physical characteristics. In other words, you might get your nose or your ears from your parents, you're going to get your intelligence from them as well. And he also strongly asserts the biological basis of the mind. And he reads Origin, and he looks at all that stuff at the beginning of Origin on domestication, the domestication of animals, and he takes it to heart. He tries to give them a really strong statistical basis. And if you think there's a reason that there's this statistical test, the Galton test, it's because he developed it as part of his examination of heritability. Now, all of those regression tests were developed to analyse the biological characteristics of populations. Galton was most interested in developing that technique to examine the issue of heritability. So here we are. In 1865, he wrote for Macmillan's magazine, Hereditary Talent and Character, and he said, "The power of man over animal life in producing whatever varieties of form he pleases is enormously great. It would seem as though the physical structure of future generations was almost as plastic as clay under the control of the breeder's will. It is my desire to show more pointedly than so far as I am aware has been attempted before, that mental qualities are equally under control. They, breeders, know with accurate prevision when particular types of animals are mated together what will be the character of their offspring. And so, what breeders do for horses and pigeons and greyhounds is something that humans should be looking at in terms of promoting the human stock, promoting the racial stock. The techniques of the breeder should be applied to the human population as it is to the population of horses. One of the things that concerns him is this whole issue of degeneration. He is worried, as many people were, that the way the society had evolved was preventing the weak from going to the wall, was preserving characteristics that were detrimental to the population or to the race, that civilization had got in the way of natural selection, and the result was degeneration. The degeneration that people observed in populations like the Irish, the way they were treated in the rest of Britain at this time, was pretty damn appalling. They were regarded as a lesser race. Ideas that are applied by people like Bertillon and Lombroso in identifying this group of habitual criminals, who aren't just habitual criminals, they're also biological criminals. That's what's caused it, biological degeneration. has made them criminals. Cesare Lombroso, whose work Criminal Man was deeply influential and argued for a eugenic approach to eradicating crime. He was a social Darwinian himself. L'uomo delinquente, published in 1876. These are some of the faces of degeneration. And again, feeding off Galton, feeding off Darwin, developing programs. Probably my favourite argument that Lombroso put forward was that tattoos were a pathological symbol of degeneration. The belief being that only a degenerate with a nervous system that was shot through with its poor evolutionary inheritance could bear the pain of being tattooed. And he uses advanced techniques at his laboratory which he sets up and his own statistical methods, and he sets out to prove his thesis. This is the Galton Anthropometric Laboratory, which starts collecting data at the International Health Exhibition in London in 1885. He's asking people to come forward, to volunteer, to be measured and assessed, and he's getting them to pay for the privilege as well. And he's doing this to collect data, to demonstrate that his theory is valid. And prior to the laboratory, he really laid down the benchmark with his book Hereditary Genius, which could be regarded as the text of eugenics. And he proposed in this book to show that a man's natural abilities are derived by inheritance, and that the careful selection of permanent breed of dogs or horses gifted with peculiar powers of running or of doing anything else. So it would be quite practical to produce a highly gifted race of men by judicious marriages during several consecutive generations. So what he's doing, improving the race characters or stock by giving the more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable. He believes that the triumph of the Anglo-Saxon race over all other races is a foregone conclusion because of natural selection. But he wants to give them the edge, by weeding out the weak stock, so the stock is improved in such a way that it will overcome all other stocks, be they Germans, Africans or Indians. Civilization had robbed natural selection of its power, allowing the unfit to flourish. And the idea was that eugenics would reverse this pattern. Now, when people talk about the Galtonian program or they talk about eugenics, they divide it into two sorts, positive and negative. Positive eugenics, this was Galton's own favoured viewpoint. Positive eugenics would be to foster more prolific breeding among the socially meritorious. So make sure that the people of good stock, who you can identify because they're up the social tree, breed with each other and have more children. Make sure that that happens, and then you're going to get better stock. And then negative eugenics, which for Galton was merely encouraging the socially disadvantageous, the Irish, the Africans and whatever, to breed less, or better yet, not breed at all. But we'll see that negative eugenics is a favoured strategy in a number of different societies. What we have to emphasise is that the Galtonian programme was biometric. It was about measuring skulls. It was about measuring heights. It was about looking at physical characteristics. It's about looking at what we would regard as the phenotype rather than the genotype. And this is because when Galton's developing his ideas, there is no sense of that divide between genotype and phenotype. Carl Pearson, who again, if you're a statistician, you won't have heard of Pearson's name because he's got quite a few of his own tests named after him for exactly the same reason. Pearson takes up Galton's torch. He's Galton's understudy, and he basically runs Galton's laboratory that's been set up at University College London on the back of the 1885 anthropometric laboratory. And Pearson is a real fan of Galton. Galton was not content with merely reaching a truth. His next step was to consider what its relation to race betterment might be. And then in 1864 we suddenly find the whole doctrine of eugenics as the salvation of mankind. But it was a salvation that was developed half a century too early. People weren't ready to actually hear it. This whole